Hello and welcome to the forum. I'm John Maddison. On this episode, we're going to talk about climate change in South Africa and Southern Africa, and then talk to the author of a new, especially insightful book about the ANC. But first, my guest is Happy Khambule, who is from Greenpeace, where he is the Senior Climate and Energy Campaign Manager for Greenpeace Africa. Welcome, Happy.
Thank you for having me.
Happy, I want to start at the beginning for people who don't know exactly why climate change is so important. There is a rapid change in climate taking place, which is expected to continue throughout the century. It's caused, most scientists agree, by the increasing emission of carbon, especially from coal and oil, and also from animals. Am I right so far?
Yes, you're quite correct. Most of it is actually from human activity, so how we use our fossil fuels, and also the manner in which we are using the land that we use for agriculture and settlement.
Right. And so let's talk first of all about the consequences for Southern Africa. One of the first consequences is we're getting hotter in Southern Africa, and that is expected to continue, causing heat stress both for humans and for animals, and leading to damages to crop activity.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the first known impacts of climate change was the reduced production of crop or yields for crops, particularly our staple crops, whether it's your maize as well as your starches. But the second one, which is becoming more and more apparent, is actually the variability between how hot it is and how wet it is. So we already knew that the acidification due to climate change was going to increase. So the Great Kalahari Desert is basically going to move up and down further into South Africa and further beyond Botswana, moving into Zambia and the region. The areas, at least within the Southern Africa bloc, will be much hotter when it is summertime, but the spells between when it rains and when it is not raining become longer. But when it rains, then it pours. And what you start to see is that the intensity of precipitation becomes more and more intense.
And so what this seems to be leading to, and from my reading, it's going to get worse, is in the east of the country, of Southern Africa, of the subcontinent, there will be more extreme rainfall events causing floods and so on, and at the same time possibly greater water problems in the west of the country, including Cape Town, where I am.
Yeah, and that's the worrying part, because that's the area where desertification is actually creeping in, right? So in the eastern region, what we didn't know in the beginning, other than yes, it might get wetter, is that most of this is also brought in from the ocean. So we're starting to see that we're getting different kinds of extreme weather events that weren't necessarily something that we tend to have. So you have flooding, you have the associated landslides around the KZN region due to us building closer to the cliffs and in the mountainous regions. But then you also have this phenomena coming from the ocean, where you start to have cyclones and in some odd cases tornadoes.
The next thing I didn't see much about is in the readings I did was about whether the impact of melting ice caps is going to raise the water levels, the sea levels. Is that a serious problem for Southern Africa? Will it affect our coastal cities?
Yeah, so there's not much work that's been done in understanding whether or not our low-lying sea level cities or territories are going to be inundated or will be reclaimed by the sea. But what we do know is for areas like Cape Town and areas like Durban, they've been modeled much more by international institutions in order to see whether or not there would be some form of sea level rise in the areas. And yes, most of the models confirm that. We just don't know to what extent, because internally, I think in South Africa, we haven't done that much work on that. We've been focusing inland more so. We've been focusing on, again, figuring out what's going to happen to our food production. We've been focusing on basically understanding even further exactly what can we plan for in terms of the extreme weather events, which in itself is becoming much harder with the governance issues that we have in South Africa. But from the modeling aspect and the technical side of things, the models have indicated and have shown most of the impact that we see. It's just that the increasing of sea levels is something that we are yet to fully appreciate and understand.
Right. So we don't really, just before we leave the subject, so we don't really fully understand what it'll do to Cape Town, whether people will have to move from the waterfront.
Yeah, we don't know, yes, to what extent. Again, as I said, I think as time goes on, we will get more and more information.
Right.
And remember that the science in South Africa is quite also not new as such, but it is still also developing specifically just to focus on the region itself and South Africa.
I understand. South Africa signed the Paris Agreement, so we're committed to it. How do you evaluate South Africa's governmental response to climate change and to after signing the Paris Agreement? Are we moving in that direction?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. I think we can evaluate it in three fronts, and we can just look at it from international, national, and the political, more so the political angle. So if we're looking at it at an international level, so the international policy framing, as well as the treaties that are there, like the Paris Agreement, South Africa tends to play a positive role, right? It tries to be a leader, it tries to broker in agreements, because the one of the big things about South Africa's foreign policy is to be able to continue multilateralism, to continue the fundamental basics of multilateralism, which is building trust between nations. And South Africa has always used this 1994 dispensation as a way to make sure that things that are pertaining to the common interest of the globe and those that affect South Africa and Africa in turn are some things that are dealt with at an international level, with solidarity and the international community coming in to support because of their capabilities that are lacking in the African continent. So it plays a really big role in international, so it's quite progressive.
Okay, but just to ask it this way, does our foreign policy match with our domestic policy, including our industrial policy?
That's where the problem lies, because essentially what happens is that our national policy or national development is only starting to catch up to what we put out internationally. And our industrial policy is not yet close, or it's not even close enough to say that it is beginning the steps. So we are only now starting to fully conceptualize and internalize the impacts of climate change and the reasons why we joined the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC, which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which the Paris Agreement sits under. So internationally, as much as we are pushing, nationally, we're only beginning to match up. But within that whole industrial policy, we're nowhere near getting to a stage where we can say these are comparable, these are actually compatible with each other.
But presumably you welcomed and thought it was should have happened rather earlier, President Ramaphosa's announcement recently that renewables, again, it's going to be easier to build renewable energy, solar and wind especially, than it has been up to now.
Yeah, I mean, we have to celebrate it because it's removing a artificial cap on renewables. But there are obviously some concerns as to why is it only within the large industrial groups that this thing is being done, and yet we haven't fundamentally addressed the domestic sector in terms of allowing renewables and incentivizing renewables to be deployed, whether it's at a rich or poor household, whether it's in the townships or in the suburbs. But we don't have the regulatory infrastructure to allow us to be able to use it where it's necessary. However, because it is one of the initial steps that are necessary, it is obviously celebrated, or rather it is welcome. The nitty-gritty in terms of the schedule itself and the regulations will determine whether or not it is a positive step and not a punitive one or a prohibitive step, because it might be that the cap is allowed, but the regulations don't allow for further propagation of new infrastructure, because the problem sits with how do you then essentially reconcile the infrastructure that ESCOM has put down, which the cities have put down, and the new infrastructure that's going to be coming from prosumers, which are large industries as well as commerce.
Yeah, we have to go to a break in a minute, but I'm going to just tell you, in 1994, I went into the Nelson Mandela government, and we opened up broadcasting. All the radio stations you listen to now were done in those first 4 years. And that was done, I'm sure there are some criticisms, but by and large, people felt it was a very good way of opening up a new sector in a way that was consistent with bringing historically disadvantaged people into the sector. And it's been one of those successes, and it's exactly the sort of thing that could be done with renewables.
Yeah, definitely. And that's why we really want to look at the residential sector even more so.
Yes. We're going to take a break, and when we get back, I'm going to ask you about Greenpeace Africa and the Climate Justice Coalition, and what your priorities are. But we're going to take a break. And we're back talking to Happy Khambule of Greenpeace Africa. What are your priorities as Greenpeace Africa?
So what the priorities in 2021 specifically is really to increase the urgency and the level of discourse around climate change and the climate crisis, because it's becoming more and more, and so a climate crisis with less inaction. With more inaction. So we are working really hard to put it through that the climate, what is the climate crisis? How does it impact our triple challenges and our development gains, as well as how do we address climate change whilst not sidelining and disenfranchising, particularly the youth, who are increasingly becoming disenfranchised and aren't able to enter the formal economy.
Now, you're working with the Climate Justice Coalition, is that right?
Correct. We're working with a number of coalitions, and one of them is the Climate Justice Coalition.
Tell us a bit more about what these various coalitions are trying to achieve.
The Climate Justice Coalition is really a broad movement base where different actors within civil society are coming together in order to push for combined and common interest in terms of climate change. So you'll have people from labor there, you'll have people from community-based organizations, and then of course you've got NGOs and in some cases international non-governmental organizations such as Greenpeace and 350. Essentially, what is in there is that the current project is called the New Green ESCOM, which is really working towards pushing the envelope around how much ESCOM, or rather, if ESCOM can and ESCOM should start looking at renewables, particularly socially owned renewables that are owned as well by the public utility, owned by community members in some cases, but those that will be able to integrate a more broader base of ownership as well as participation in the electricity sector in addressing climate change. I think there are other areas which are there, which go to workers' education, that go into awareness within communities. So that's the Climate Justice Coalition. Then there's also South African Climate Action Network, which works at the policy level, but also integrates community-based organization into discussing and being able to interact and engage in policy. So when you look at the climate change bill, if we're looking at the now being discussed nationally determined contributions, which form part of South Africa's contribution to the international community under the Paris Agreement, you'd have those kinds of conversations, you'll have capacity building, and then you'll try to have as much of the considerations that are coming from the community-based organization moving all the way up into the decision makers. So we're working on both fronts where we're focusing on the broad movement as well as the specific policy-orientated approach with the different coalitions that we're part of. But we also have endorsed a different set of coalitions similar to what is called the Climate Justice Charter, which is essentially a charter that is going into the less identified areas within society, getting in to understand and also put forward charter considerations that can be adopted at parliament level in order for the climate crisis to be taken in a more serious approach concerning the legislatures as well as the actual National Assembly taking a motion and a decision on adopting more climate resilient as well as more climate-focused legislation.
I want to come in here. I saw from some of the documents that the government came up with a nationally determined contribution to its commitment to the Paris Agreement. Is that? I know at first you were dissatisfied with that. Is that going well? And at the same time, your discussions with ESCOM, do you feel they're responsive?
Well, I mean, the discussions with ESCOM lately have been happening through the Climate Justice Coalition, and
Yes.
There has been a very positive response. I think the Climate Justice Coalition has been working pretty well, particularly with the Office of the Just Transition Office, and the broader, obviously, holding company. The considerations that are coming out are quite key because if we have to also remember that in Mpumalanga, ESCOM is also undertaking particular projects that speak to the just transition. As much as there are people there who are dealing and working in the technical sense, the social and the environmental aspects of the just transition can be lost because it can be quickly bottled down to just technology and economics. So the Climate Justice Coalition is bringing in the urgency of climate, but also making sure that the just transition is focusing on the justice element of the transition towards renewables.
So sorry, so just to come in here, so a just transition really means finding ways that people who lose jobs in coal, for instance, will be able to be retrained and integrated, and communities will benefit from the move to renewables, whether it's solar or wind or other things. How is that going? Is it really practical? Will the unions go for it? Does it really work?
Well, I think we need to understand that the just transition as a concept is still being defined by different actors in at least in South Africa more broadly. Yes, we've got a working definition as to what the just transition is, but the point of the just transition is to address climate change, right? So you are going to transition anyway. But in order for South Africa to transition in a way which is orderly, as well as which does not disrupt the economy too much, whilst leaving people behind, you need to include justice. So where you can save jobs, where you can reskill people, and where you can and should be able to allow new people to come into this new industry. So from Labour's perspective, obviously you'd understand that the bare membership that is there from Labour needs to be protected because it's coming from a highly polluted, indecent work environment, which is coal or fossil fuel based, moving into renewables. So they need to protect the workers in that context. But companies are looking at the just transition and saying, look, we can't quickly jump from just producing coal and oil from coal to go to renewables and hydrogen technologies. We need time in order to get there and also to build the necessary capital to jump to the next or to move to the next economies or to the next sectors. So people look at it differently, whereas the companies are not looking at the jobs that they can be saving, but the new jobs that can be allowed. Unions are coming in and saying we can save these jobs, whereas the government is thinking, well, we've still got a triple challenge and we can't have more rates of unemployment going. So how do we balance the interests of those who are still in the coal industry or the fossil fuel industry and those that should be adopted and integrated into the new industry? So there's still a definitional issue that's there that needs to happen. From civil society's point of view, it's been clear that the just transition needs to happen because the transition is occurring anyway. It's either you are ahead of the curve, within the curve, or behind, and South Africa is starting to fall behind. At one point, we were within the curve and actually dictating the measure in which we would be undergoing this transition. But we were missing a justice element, and that's where the unions have come in to say you can't actually just let everybody go who's stuck in the fossil fuel economy. You have to start bringing us in. So through the presidential commission. Well, I say I mean within the term of the commission. Hopefully, it will be quite soon, and we'll then get a sense of how do we understand the just transition and which considerations need to be prioritized versus ones that can be traded off or compromised on.
So is it premature to ask your priorities in relation to, for instance, I mean, when I look at it from the outside, I wonder why we're not doing more about incentivizing people to shift to electric vehicles. It's still high taxes to do it. Our car companies, charging stations throughout South Africa. Surely all those things are urgent. Shouldn't those be done immediately?
Yeah, well, with the strategies that we've had in South Africa, these things would have been rolling out right now. So we've had plans for years. We've had policies and strategies that speak to specific timelines and milestones to achieving, for example, a massive rollout of chargers for electric vehicles. But I think in some cases, there's sectors where we will be front runners. There'll be sectors that we are late adopters. For cars, for example, I think it is pretty clear that South Africa needs to adopt a much more cautious approach, particularly as to how we're going to be using the different, or where we're going to be placing the different stations as well, and the kinds of modular approaches that would come with charging different vehicles. So, for example, in the United States, cars cannot charge from the same charging stations because they have different plugs. In South Africa, you wouldn't want that kind of situation. People would want universal accessibility to those charging stations, but we would need to roll out the infrastructure. We've had these discussions, at least in part before, but they were not actioned on because I think that the government as well as the industry was waiting for a moment where the global pickup and the global trends would be at a higher rate, and then we would just be able to come in part of the value chain, but not be the progenitors or the designers of any particular initiative. But when it comes to renewables and households and electricity generation, that's a different space altogether. We were front runners at one point in time, and we have the capability to be able to do it at a higher rate. So caution can be thrown to the wind in order to develop and deploy renewables at a faster rate, as well as reaching the capacity that is required so that we're not stuck in a situation where we've got load shedding and increasing prices, as well as the unstable supply that we currently have.
So, I mean, I still feel a little frustrated that we could be moving faster, but on the other hand, you seem to feel fairly optimistic that we can reimagine South Africa after COVID-19 in a way that is constructive.
Yeah, so I think the changes are happening in any case, right? It depends which actor within society is making those changes. So we know that businesses are running full steam ahead, particularly those that are attached to international markets and those that have international linkages. They are pushing quite steadily and aggressively ahead to make sure that they protect their own competitive advantage, but also they are fit for purpose moving into this new world beyond COVID-19, and that addresses climate change. The problem sits where we have to balance the interests, and that's from the state side, without providing signals as well as the vision of where we are going. And that's where I think we will start to see changes from the political class, is that when they start to see that globally the trend is moving away from a fossil-based economy and away from the current approach that we're employing in recovering from COVID-19, then we will start to see big changes. So I'm not so worried about the political side. What I'm worried about is more the institutional makeup that we have in South Africa to allow us to be able to incentivize, to be able to take the early wins, as well as to capture the low-hanging fruit. That's where the situation is kind of dragging its feet. For example, NERSA hasn't still put forward guidelines which municipalities need to adopt and build on in order to register houses to provide solar, to deploy solar on their roofs and then be able to feed back to the grid. That's not there. We still don't have an industrial policy that speaks to how we're going to be able to deploy solar panels or manufacture them in South Africa as we are increasing the renewable industry. Those are some of the problems we have.
We have to stop there, but that's an exciting moment to end. Happy Khambule of Greenpeace Africa, thanks so much for being on the show. We're going to have to get you back. And when we come back, we'll be talking to Professor Susan Booysen about her new book on the ANC, Precarious Power. And we're back. My next guest is Professor Susan Booysen. She's a professor at Wits University in politics and government, and she's just published her 4th book on the ANC, Precarious Power. Susan, welcome.
Thank you, John.
Susan, you describe a government and an ANC with great insight, which is quite disturbing because you call it precarious power. And I think that in a way, you talk about things that we already know, but you describe them in a new way, which is disturbing but not surprising. Where do we start? Let's just start with the strategy that the ANC used to get elected in 2019. You say they did their own internal polling, and they discovered that if Jacob Zuma was not part of the ANC, they probably wouldn't get to 50%. And so unity was hence an important theme, but you call the unity a mirage.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And you're very accurate and driving right to the core of the issue. The ANC had to construct a leadership and a campaign and a party that could win another election. And that was the story back a few years ago, in 2019. And in a run up to that, the ANC's internal polling certainly indicated that if Jacob Zuma, we knew he couldn't run for a second term as president, for a third term, sorry, as the president of the country, but if he or a person close to him would run, the ANC would not reach that outright majority of 50%. And that is where it was also shown that Cyril Ramaphosa, with his reputation for being cleaner in a corruption stakes, would certainly give the ANC that chance of winning an outright majority. And that played a big role in the 2017 ANC internal elections at Nasrec. And because Zuma was ousted by the ANC soon after Nasrec as president of the country, or at least pushed into resignation, that Cyril Ramaphosa could come in and drive that campaign of a united ANC with a cleaner agenda that is committed to doing good governance, clean government, honest government. And that campaign obviously worked for the ANC. And hence we saw an ANC emerging from 2019 elections that had recovered a bit on his previous electoral performances to a more solid 57.5 majority, and the ANC seemed to be all fine. But we know it was not just one ANC. And that is one of the reasons why ANC power is so precarious. There were several ANCs contesting in that election, but one had the predominance there, that is Cyril Ramaphosa Anti-Corruption ANC, and they could persuade the voters.
Susan, I want to interrupt you. We'll come back to the ANC in a minute, but I think the most important insight in your book, for me at least, was that there is a parallel government that Cyril Ramaphosa believes, because you say his control of the ANC was like a kind of hostile takeover, and that there's continuous plotting in the ANC, that he had to set up a kind of parallel government. You have various terms you use for it. What does that mean to you, and what does it mean for government? Because it also seems to be that you're saying that the plotting inside the ANC creates major distractions from government, and that's one of the reasons why government is not performing.
Yes, yes, that is disturbing indeed. You know, there's one layer, the official layer, and that official layer of government is often so infused with former factionists, Zumas, or people who are just outright against Ramaphosa. And of course, that those configurations also change over time. But the faces change, the campaigns don't really change. And there are parallel structures, therefore, that leaders, also Ramaphosa in his presidency, has to rely on to consolidate their own power, to be able to do things, to create legitimacy for their own campaigns. They, we see their various presidential advisory committees. They're not new, but there are more of them under Ramaphosa, and he really relies on them to bring legitimacy to his own campaigns. He has, of course, in the last few months, managed quite well, but not altogether, but quite well to consolidate his power in ANC better than it had been, and that means his say over government. But it remains such a minefield which he has to tread very, very carefully. And that
But
makes that power very precarious at that level as well.
I want to just keep on government for a moment, because I think a lot of us feel that the cabinet isn't really functioning and that the cabinet isn't really running the country effectively. This is obviously a very, very serious issue. But you articulated, I think your book is the first time I've seen it articulated and so forcefully articulated, that government is distracted and incapacitated. And so when the president wants to get something done, he doesn't use cabinet, he goes and finds something else.
Yes, yes, indeed. Because cabinet is a construct of it, that this is a very delicate balance of political power. And so, as we know from the current debates, is so much dead wood in there, so many people who should really not be there. We do not know whether there are better alternatives out there, but there is a lot of dead wood in this cabinet, but it can't
Right.
really be changed because it is this balancing trick. And so the president has to move beyond that to get things done, to bring in sometimes private sector, sometimes non-governmental agencies, sometimes advisory boards to help him take his decisions.
You use this term district development. Just explain that to me.
Now, John, there is a parallel system of local government that is coming into place, falling into place. That's called the district development model. And that is somewhere between the provinces and the municipal government. And
When did that come in?
now it's gradually, it's still taking shape. That model is still taking shape. It is over the last year and a half that we've seen more articulation of that. It is not fully operational, but it has started rolling out. It's a conduit for funds for development projects where government nationally just cannot pump more, and we see that in the most recent Auditor General report as well. It cannot pump in more and more money into local governments where it's absolutely uncertain what it will be used for, and there is no regard for the objective of clean audits
No,
and
no.
good governance at
Now,
all.
I want to link that to what you say about the national level, because this is a much bigger thing than I think we've realized before. You talk about the NCCC, the National COVID Command Council, which was set up when the pandemic started and was a way of getting around cabinet at a national level. So you're saying it's very systematic. At a national level, you have the National Command Council getting around the cabinet, and then at a local level, you have the district development. So this is really a rather profound undermining of our constitutional system.
I really do think so. It is evidence of a formal system that is described in the Constitution, in our multi-party political system as well. That is also in the Constitution, that really does not work. It is in place, it's going through the rituals, but it's really not working effectively. And so these alternate layers are there. And so it is really something, a complete parallel, not complete, not wall to wall, but extensive, far-reaching system of alternative and supplementary government.
And you're saying that when President Ramaphosa wants to get something done, he has come to expect that the usual channels, the constitutional channels, that's the cabinet and the city councils and town councils, are unlikely to be adequate. And so he has alternative methods.
Yes, indeed, indeed. And yes, it extends across the spheres or layers of government. And wherever we look, it is there. And of course, I'm not sure whether that's a question you're still going to ask, but it comes to policy making as well, also part of official policy making of the government. There's so much with that, there's policy measures, initiatives, but those really are a water trading, part of a water trading exercise. To the extent that when it comes to ground level, people often just take policy. And I use a variety of examples of that in the book, where it ranges from e-tolls, where road users, Gauteng highway, freeway maker users make their own policy, to in local government and local level, where people claim land and take land, and government follows and goes softly on the initiatives where people make their own policy because they
Susan,
know they've not been delivering adequately.
Susan, we're going to go to a break in a minute, but I just want to dwell on this subject at a national level for a minute. I mean, that seems right to me because you look at the way we've had an energy policy that was in conflict with the Paris Climate Agreement and our commitments there, and yet it didn't change. And then finally the president comes in and says we're now going to allow a whole lot of renewables against the policy of his own senior cabinet member. And you have a similar thing where the president is calling for digital migration and spectrum allocation to get jobs and Wi-Fi and broadband going, and yet it doesn't seem to happen at cabinet level. We're going to go to the break in about 40 seconds, but is that a correct way of seeing it? Is this really how it works?
Yes, on the energy front, we definitely saw presidential intervention there, overriding Gwede Mantashe's as Minister of Energy, and getting some motion into policy that had been stalling, embarrassingly so, and putting South Africa through another energy crisis,
But
ESCOM cut
but
crisis.
but we really have to go to a break in a minute. But I just want to ask, why can't the president just call in the minister? Why couldn't he have called him in a year ago? I mean, we've had our commitment to the Paris Agreement and to renewables for a long time. Why couldn't he just call him in and say, no, I want this reversed?
I think that is very much part of Cyril Ramaphosa's style. He tries to negotiate people into positions and try to let circumstances fall into positions where no other decision is possible, and he can abscond and say, be seen not to have taken decisions that might have antagonized other people. And that is his style of governance. And I think he pushed, and that's embarrassing, and that was wrong, to push South Africa into another major load shedding series of major load shedding
Before
crises.
he acted.
And yes, and the decision almost took shape because ESCOM was so embarrassing low on supply that it was obvious there's nothing else to do.
We must take a break, but we'll be right back with Professor Susan Booysen. And we're back talking to Professor Susan Booysen about her new book, Precarious Power. Susan, we were talking about the sort of strange parallel system that has been developing in the government, and you are the most outspoken in your book in saying how far this has gone here. But I wanted to ask you how this relates, because I've wondered for a long time. Our system of a constitutional system at the level of parliamentary MPs, members of the provincial councils and town councils, they don't seem to be major factors you would expect when there are protests, that they'd be major figures. I mean, that really goes back right since 1994. They're not really playing the role you'd expect of them, are they?
No, really, really not. You know, in a way, it's a huge, massively costly patronage system, status system, where people get elected to positions and pass laws, adopt policies from time to time, but then do not assume responsibility for the whole governance process. Do not see through those policies. It's such a cliche by now that we have wonderful policies, quote unquote, but they do not get implemented. But that is the way that this government operates. And they use as evidence of what they have done, minimally what is changed on the ground, and massively what is the policy processes that are unfolding, the measures, the new initiatives that have been adopted. So it is also a very irresponsible way of governance.
Now, you also say that the ANC itself, its own constitutional structures are precarious too.
Yes, yes, indeed, indeed. If we look at, for example, the National Executive Committee of the ANC, which is the highest between conference decision-making body in the country, how much it has been paralyzed in recent times, very recent times, there have been more of a change. Cyril Ramaphosa more consolidating his power there. And yet, so often that body is paralyzed and struggles just to get consensus on how to implement, if they get to that point, how to implement a policy that had been adopted at this national conference.
And so the result is, I think you quote the figure of 20%, as low as 20% of ANC supporters feel confident about the ANC's future.
Yes, indeed, and that is very, very scary. If instability in the air in that way, it is so low, so that confidence is so low, and yet when it comes to elections, there is no other party that is being voted for,
Right.
and so the ANC base is really contracting, and yet no opposition party is ready, is good enough to step into that position. So people tend to give the ANC their ANC because the ANC has so much traction in its reputation as a former liberation movement, that people just keep continuously give it second chances and hope that the next time it's going to be better. And the ANC is very astute in playing that voter inclination.
But you don't think that there is a good ANC waiting to triumph?
That is what the ANC has been making South trying to get, and often effectively getting South Africans to believe for such a long time. And they manage each time when it comes to elections to manufacture and remanufacture that hope that things are going to be better. And it is that it is going to be a better party, a more honest and a cleaner party.
And you don't see that?
Very successful in getting the voters to suspend that disbelief.
But you don't believe that's going to happen?
I believe that the ANC is still on track, roughly, to get voters for another few times to believe that there is a better ANC in the making. But that skepticism is growing, that distrust is growing all the time.
But my question to you is, do you think there's a good ANC coming that is going to triumph? Do you think that a clean ANC is possible?
I do not see that. I see how the ANC manufactures that image, and we all know how good, laudable its history's liberation involvement is, but I do not see that ANC budding under.
So you do look a little bit at the future in your other writings on Daily Maverick and elsewhere. What do you think is going to happen in the municipal elections this year? Will it be pretty much a boring outcome where the ANC seems to stay in control and not much changes, and people aren't very enthusiastic about the DA, that the EFF, the Economic Freedom Front, will continue to have its level of support, maybe a little bigger, but not much changes?
John, yes, I think that is one of the big prospects, if we can call it a prospect in that sense of the word, that is lingering, because we have what we've got to go by is the by-election results. That's one of the points we've got to go by, and there the ANC has been doing well in the batches of by-elections that we've had from around third quarter of last year onward. They have been retaining seats. They've been winning a few seats of the DA. In one case, a land party in Hoofstrand, Hermanus have won a seat from the ANC. So the ANC is also taking knocks, but bigger knocks than the ANC is the DA. They have been taking big knocks in these by-elections, and the public opinion polls, they are very sketchy at this stage because of COVID and not good access as we had in the past to do proper sampling. But to the extent that they can be believed, they are reliable. They show that the ANC is maintaining levels of support, and opposition parties are not making serious gains and inroads. So it it is going to be deja vu when we come to local elections.
Susan,
Later.
for people like you and me who are interested in the governance and successful governance of South Africa, my last book, Cyril's Choices, was really looking at how you fix specific policies that could create jobs. And for me, it's not rocket science. There are ways to create jobs. I mean, what President Ramaphosa finally did a few weeks ago in terms of renewable energy was one obvious way. It's just that it's something that we've known for 5 or 10 years and wasn't done. Do you see anything on the horizon? I mean, is civil society a possible place where you could push towards better governance? Because you don't give much hope from the ANC or from the official opposition or for other parties. Is there somewhere in South Africa that could come from?
Well, civil society has been playing an incredibly important role, and and that works in conjunction, unfortunately, but maybe necessarily, and often with good outcomes, in conjunction with the court system, with the judiciary, that come in and help the government take decisions that it would not otherwise have taken, get commissions of inquiry, and bring better accountability, like we've seen the Zondo Commission too. Better accountability, not instant success and results, but much progress on moving the parameters of getting better governance. And so hopefully that can help the ANC push the ANC, but the task is so big and the levels of yet to be discovered misappropriation is so big. We have hardly started dipping into local government and the misappropriation or misgovernance that's happening there, apart from reports that are from the Auditor General, but it also shows how there is just no progress on that front. So better government is not just waiting to emerge via the ANC, but then the other parties are not coming there too, and that has serious implications for the constitutionality of our official system.
We have about 60 seconds. I'm afraid the time has gone so fast because these things you're raising are so interesting, and I'd love to be able to refute them, but I don't think I can. They sound logical to me. Just to finish up, you described Cyril's Ramaphosa's victory in the ANC as a hostile takeover of the ANC, that the ANC continues to be plotting. Just before we finish up, what do you think is going on inside the ANC? Is it just full of plotting that isn't really about government, and is it going to continue?
Well, what's going on in ANC is, of course, the power parameters change all the time. And Cyril Ramaphosa, sort of halfway through his ANC term, a bit more than halfway, is known to be consolidating power. And to the extent that that exists, that realization exists, people tend to go with him and support him. But it is not, I think we're currently seeing peace before a big storm. Because in a final run up to next year's ANC internal elections, they probably still be happening towards the end of next year. Then there are new contenders are going to come up, and new people are going to try to challenge Cyril Ramaphosa. And the question will be whether he can continue consolidating and maintain his base, because the infighting will continue. There will be internal changes in parameters, and one of those changes have been that Cyril Ramaphosa is consolidating more, but the opponents against Ramaphosa have not stopped plotting. And we continue seeing little bits of rumors emerging here and there, but then candidates also get discredited, often through corruption here and there. And in a sense of bigger accountability nationally, it will be very interesting to see whether my Ramaphosa can actually consolidate further.
I'm afraid we have to end it there, Susan, on a not altogether hopeful note, but hopefully there is progress to be seen in the future. Susan Booysen, thanks so much for talking to us. Her book is Precarious Power. It makes some really, I think, quite explosive insights come out of it. But they're ones I find difficulty in disagreeing with. Thanks for watching. I'm John Mattison. I hope to see you next week on the forum.